Fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. On 6.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. It's Mr. Dave Dollar Store Rama Martini.
I'm here.
Yeah. What's going
What's the
on?
name for the name?
Yeah. Well, it can't be karate. Well, I guess you're still doing karate. How much longer you got to do that for?
Forever.
I mean, forever.
Forever.
Jeez,
So my body wears out.
Well, that's not far.
Yeah, that's true.
You got a season left.
If I'm lucky.
If you're lucky. Well, that's, I mean, hey, it's your way of keeping in shape, keeping that,
That's right.
that Hemsworth body.
That's right. I'm working towards it.
Hemsworth when he's in the old age home.
Yeah. Well, there was a Thor movie where he was fat, so,
Oh, there you go. Perfect. Fat Thor.
Yeah. Fat Thor. Yeah.
Terrible.
It was a thing.
Awful.
It really happened.
Well, somebody's got to do it. Well, let's see. Let's just jump into it. We've got
Right.
a writer here from Kazakhstan, and of course his book, his newest book anyway, is called Boom Boom's Last Call. So that should be interesting. So, Mr. Jeff Houlahan, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Really happy to have a chance to chat.
Well, we'll see.
I actually remember from some of your shows that is the thing. Yeah, you asked. Yeah, we'll see into the show. I'm pretty sure I'll have enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, there's only been a few hang-ups in the years. Nothing major. So what's going on with you? How do you get into this this writing thing? Because this came along later in your life, right? Or you haven't been writing all your life. This was something you just... No,
it didn't. Yeah, and really it was probably, it's now almost 14 or 15 years ago, but I'm guessing, even writers that start late in their lives, I think it's probably always was a thing. I was a reader. I had started a novel in my 20s and thrown it away, and I'd started another one in my 30s and thrown it away. And I was working at that point as a waiter and getting a degree. But my creative outlet then was that I was playing in a punk band. I was playing in a band in Ottawa and, writing songs, but then ended up, after my degree, getting a job as a professor out here in Eastern Canada, in St. John, New Brunswick. And at some point, I'd gone away on my first sabbatical and said, okay, I'm going to write a book while I'm on sabbatical. And got back from sabbatical and had written about 100 words. And at that point and I think I was 50. I think I was 50 years old. And at that point I either take this seriously and actually start writing seriously, or I give this up, that you're not gonna write it. And that summer I started getting up every Saturday morning and writing for 4 hours, and that was my thing. And I've been doing that essentially 52 weeks a year for the last 14 years. Get up every Saturday morning, write for 4 hours, and then in the evenings I'll find time to go back and rewrite and edit. But those 4 hours are writing new words on a book, once a week. And if you write, and I'm a pretty fast writer, so if if you write a couple thousand words a week, at the end of every year, you've got a book.
So you were in a punk band. Well, that ought to be interesting.
Yeah, and I was in the band for 13 years. There was a band called the Rain Kings in Ottawa. We played around town, and we did originals and all of that, and we had aspirations to be good. We just weren't.
Right. What did you have, like a mohawk or purple hair or something?
No, I managed to figure out how to dress like a hipster. I didn't have the mohawk. No. And at this point, mohawks aren't a choice for me yet.
You could buy a stick-on one.
Yes, I could. I could. But and it was a great time to play in a band because we started, and I would say there was one of us that could play an instrument, the rest of us were learning, and it was that time in the early '80s when it was all do it yourself, and but we played together for 13 years, made CDs, made tapes, did all that, and it was great. And it was a total creative outlet. Yeah, it was awesome.
Yeah. Did you open up for the Cult?
No, but I can tell you, and I don't know how many people would remember this, but we did open for a band we opened for the Goo Goo Dolls.
Oh, well, there you go.
But it was it wasn't a springboard to fame, I'll say
No, you have to sleep with the band in order to get
that. There's some lines I just won't cross.
And you're a punker. There's no lines you won't cross.
That was the message, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. And, it was funny because, when we started, it was at a time when it was almost a bad thing to be good on your instrument. We were laughing at, people like Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin and the 8-minute guitar solos, because that was, and, I have looked back and go, we actually thought it was a positive to not be good on your instrument, which is a crazy music. Like, we had a lot of fun, and I'll never act like it was a hobby. We were trying to do good things and writing music and writing songs, and, we just weren't that good.
Yeah, well, but that's how you get good, and you just got to hit it at the right time and keep working at it, and, you just keep doing it. So now you've gone into this writing life. What kind of stories are you primarily trying to write? Like, what's your genre, I guess they call it? And,
it's funny, because I do, what's been published, so Boom Boom's Last Call is the second book, Long Train Home was the first. I've got a 3-book deal with Level Best, and the next will probably be crime fiction, but I wouldn't say I have, that's the genre I stay in. Now, at this point, I've got, 13 or 14 or 15 manuscripts on the hard drive, and they kind of cover the gamut from, historical things to what I would think of as kind of contemporary fiction, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 that would fall into the crime genre. But, I have the luxury of, because it's not my day job, I have the luxury of being able to write whatever I want to write. And so it's whatever story hits me. And Boom Boom's Last Call in particular, like, it was a different approach than any of the other books. I'd actually just written an opening line. The opening line to that book was something I'd written and had nothing else around it, and then just decided I want to figure out who the person is that said that line, and so that whole book ended up just imagining who was the person who said the opening line to that book. And I would say none of my other books are like that, and they come from different places, and they end up being about very different things.
So where do they come from for you? Like, you're talking about, are they inspired from real events, or are they inspired from something you've seen or someone you've known?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think probably, a combination of things. And I could go to a lot of my books, so I've written a book called First American Hero that's historical. It's about a guy who 12,000 years ago searching for his daughter that gets kidnapped. And that just came from, I don't know if you've ever driven across the Rockies from Vancouver to Lillooet. You're a Canadian. Have you ever done that drive over the Rockies?
Yeah, several times. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think it's Brandywine Falls, is it? That there's a spot you can pull off there, and there's falls there. And standing there and just looking out over that lake and going, what would it have been like to be the first person? You've come across the Bering Strait. You're the first people to see this. What would that have been like? And so that was the impetus for that.
Yeah, I would have been thinking about, would this be a good place to dump the body?
I guess. Yes, I guess if everything's crime, then that would be the thought. Yeah, but so, and then I read another book was I read an article in New York Times about these 2 women blues singers from the 1920s that they discovered a couple of recordings by them, but that's all they knew of them, and just this thought of having that kind of creative genius, and at that time being black and a woman and having no outlet for it, what would that have been like? So, it's different things, and the great thing is, whatever hooks me, I get to write about.
Does it start with a character, or does it start with the actual story idea?
So now I have to actually think about that for a second, because I think probably with the one I was talking about, the 2 blues singers, it starts with imagining those 2 characters and trying to figure out a through line for that. But then there'll be other things where like the historical one, where it is definitely an idea for a story. So if I'm going to have someone here first, what's the dramatic impetus? What's driving it forward? And it's that he's looking for his young daughter that's been kidnapped, and he's going to have to walk across America to find her and bring her back. And so then it was the story. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say I have a process that's always the same from one to the next. And the project I'm working on now comes from, what I see as a fundamental change coming in science, both with AI and with CRISPR-Cas9. I don't know if you're familiar with CRISPR-Cas9, but there's this basic, it's a technological thing where we're going to be able to go in and basically play with, people's, but also animals' DNA and just make them what we want. And we're going to be able to construct people's genetics. So just playing with that idea. So that arose more from this idea of we've got these scientific advances coming. What's it going to mean for what human beings are 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now? So that's more of a concept than either of those, a story or a character.
So, okay, so your characters then, how does that develop then? So if you're not starting it with a character like the two ladies that were singing the blues, so you don't have that in mind. So for instance, with Boom Boom's Last Call, what you have Einstein Flint. That's a name. And so that character there, where did Einstein come from, and how do you interact with that character?
Yeah, that's great, because that really did come from, that line was, I had the line written down, and it was then, who is this guy? Like, who is this guy that he says this, fairly outrageous thing about his ex-girlfriend? Well, who is he? And then it is just building on that guy, and it is really this idea, okay, it's going to open with him being interrogated in an interrogation room in a police station about the death of his ex-girlfriend. And, I suspect you're familiar with this too, having written this, once you start to kind of inhabit a character, they grow. It is, and there's no question that despite the fact that these stories come from different places, I do think, for me, all the best books, it's the characters that end up keeping me in the story. All of my favorite books, if the character's not right, I can't stay with it. So whether there's a concept or a story that is good, if the character's not working, the book doesn't work for me as a reader. And so the same as a writer, I think I have to be invested in my characters. And so definitely Einstein Flint was somebody that I was figuring him out as I'm going along. And even the name came from there was a Toronto Blue Jay player at one time. His name was Darwin Barney, and I just loved the idea of this famous scientist with this kind of Barney Rubble, this kind of cartoon character name, that combination. And so I thought, someday when I'm going to have a character that's not going to be Darwin Barney, but it's going to have that kind of odd name combination. And then once you get it in your head that, okay, I know the kind of character he's going to be, and he's going to be bouncing, and he's going to be banged up from not only his life, but from having ridden rodeo, and he's kind of trying to figure out where he's headed. And then in that, one of my favorite characters in Boom Boom's Last Call is his buddy, Thule, Troy Fatula, who's bipolar and struggling with that. But they are absolutely best friends from kids. And, as you're writing, you're going, Einstein needs someone. Who's that going to be? And, I think you're a writer, these characters can kind of appear for you, and you go, that works. That character's working.
Well, Einstein Flint, he's a rodeo rider, but it seems like he was born in Brooklyn. How did that happen?
Yeah, and that was totally just feeling like, okay, how am I going to make this an oddity? Because for starters, I'll occasionally tune into the rodeo, but one of the things, the reason I actually thought about him being a rodeo rider was, when I think of rodeo riders, it is this idea that they're really athletic, really strong, but often really compact guys. They're not generally 6'4", 220. They're generally, to me, 5'10", 170, lean, strong. And so I had this in my head that, okay, that's the kind of guy he's going to be. And how do we make this unusual? Well, we make it, he's actually a New Yorker. He spent most of his life as a kid in the 5 boroughs, but then ended up west and was tough and brave and learned how to do this. And I don't fill in that backstory very much. There's not much about rodeo. It's just that's who he is, and it's banged him up a little bit. And he got there kind of as an orphan who leaves New York, heading west, looking for something, and that's where he ends up.
Well, it's kind of an interesting thought. So, yeah, how do you yourself make the character likable, in a sense that even if they do good things, bad things, the whole gamut of character.
Yeah.
I think that's the trick, right? Because, long-term characters for people like Sherlock Holmes, there's people that certain characters can just take a story and take it for 100 years and people still are buying and liking that character. So what's your kind of concept?
Yeah, I guess, when I think of Einstein Flint, for example, I go, look, he's flawed in certainly in some ways, but I guess there's always two characteristics that I guess in the characters that I love and that I connect to, it's courage and compassion, and they're characteristics that I both of which I wish personally I had more of, and I think this is an interesting thing to me always about writers, is I think writers' best characters are in some cases the people they would aspire to be, the kind of person they would want to be, I look at Einstein Flint and go, he's ballsy, he's got guts, he's loyal to his friends, and he stands for as long as he can stand, and he has his friends back, but at the same time he cares about people. He's not indifferent, but he can be quick to anger and quick to throw punches, but there has to be this kind of streak of integrity that's kind of built from courage and compassion, and I think those are often the characters in books I read that I'm drawn to, where they're not perfect, they're flawed, and in some ways they're often, old-fashioned, the men especially. But it is those two things. Do they stand up when you need someone to stand up, and have they got some compassion, some kindness in them? And I think almost anybody can relate to those kind of people.
Well, obviously you haven't read my books, otherwise you'd see perfect.
It's interesting though, Alan, because I had an agent early on, Phil Spitzer, and Phil passed in the last couple of years, and Phil was actually the agent he was James Lee Burke's agent and Michael Connolly's agent and Ken Bruin's agent, and so it's an agent for some. And actually, it was a huge thrill of my life when Phil responded to my query, because James Lee Burke at that point would have been my favorite writer in the world, and to imagine that Phil Spitzer would represent me was just a huge thrill. But after we tried to sell Long Train Home and couldn't, but I sent him my second book, a book called Percocet Blues, and that character, he actually said, I can't try and sell this book, Jeff, because this character, I just want to punch him in the face. And so I could read you the email from Phil about that. And so, all of my characters don't have this, like that character in Percocet Blues. He's not a good guy, but even him, he's looking for redemption. Even at his lowest, he wants to be better than he is. And so I don't always manage to write the characters that I admire as much. But I love that character because he was just trying to be.
He's what you want it to be.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. So what is your relation? Do you hear your characters? Do you hear them? Do you talk to them?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and I don't know if you do this, but I've realized over the years that not everybody does this. But, I know in my own head, a lot of, when I'm in my head, it's often I'm having conversations with people. I'm having, imaginary conversations. So I think I hear dialogue all the time. And so when I'm thinking about my characters and the next scene and where things are going, I am hearing dialogue in my head for sure.
And you're teaching people, children?
Children. I'm a prof, so I teach. The youngest is probably 18.
That's still dangerous.
And they don't get to hear all the conversations I'm having in my head.
No, but how do they know who's teaching?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Yes, but first year students, they're less worried about what's going on in my head than what mark I'm giving them on their midterm.
Yeah.
When you're hearing these characters, do they end up surprising you? Do they take the plot off the rails a bit and make it difficult for you to go where you want to go, or do you feel like you're more in control?
I would say I don't think I've ever had that experience of feeling like the character's taking me someplace I don't want to go. I think I'm probably more in control than that, I guess. And I'm not sure, I'm not sure that that's a good thing. I think I suspect there's something to be said for how strong and real a character would be if they could actually take me somewhere else. I think usually, but having said that, when I start those Saturday morning sessions, I usually have an idea what the opening that morning, where I'm starting, but it often goes places that I didn't anticipate when I started. But I wouldn't say that's really that the character necessarily has taken me somewhere unexpected. It's just that as things have moved along, I've seen a place where this could take an interesting turn, or almost maybe, and I guess this would be something like what you're saying, or maybe the characters ended up in a spot where it has to go in a certain direction for them to keep moving forward. And so, yeah, I'm not a writer. I hear about, what do they call it? Do they call it planners and pantsers or something? People that have everything mapped out. I'm not that. I often have what I would think of as 6 or 8 or a dozen critical scenes that I think have to happen somewhere along the way. But then how I get from scene to scene is often, not planned at all. It's as I'm writing, there's places it goes.
Writing an evil or dark character in the book, how do you get into the mindset of that? Yeah,
that is harder, eh? And sometimes I think, because in this book, probably, the bad guys are Raoul Vargas, who's the cartel guy, and actually Einstein's boss, Freddie Riley. And I think of them as two different kinds of bad. Like, Freddie is just a character who is, he's out for Freddie. He's self-interested, and that's what he does always. He acts in his own interests, and, not getting pleasure in other people's misery, but willing to have people be miserable if it serves him. And I guess I just see that, we know people like that, and do I think I do a great job of capturing that? It's hard to know, right? It's hard to know. Are you really getting inside a person like that's head? And then to me, it's even, so that one I can actually understand better, because I think we've all at times in our life probably done things we regret out of self-interest. And so we can kind of understand how that happens. Someone like Raoul Vargas, who's just straight out and out a guy, he's a guy that's running a cartel and he's ruthless. I don't know if I capture that as well, because I don't know if I know what that kind of headspace would be as well.
Oh, you're not dressing up and pretending to be the character and going out and doing bad things.
No, a little just an idea there, Alan.
Well, that's if you need, you need ideas. That's what I'm here for.
How do you, like, you've probably written about more kind of really evil people. Like, how do you find that headspace?
Oh, I just dress up and act like them. I don't really, for the most part, it doesn't bother me. I can get into it easily, but sometimes it does, depending on how real it is and how if it's a real story that I'm working on, and if a lot of the people are still alive today, that tends to bother me more than taking historical characters and living through them. You know what I mean?
Right.
But so because it's also something I quite often I'll ask writers is, because when you write over the last year or whatever time it was for you to write this book, you're kind of living through your character, day to day as you're writing it, and you're putting them through things and you're experiencing, and you kind of have to weigh it out, like you're doing this to the person and this is happening, and you kind of see if it's realistic. And so you have to work through all of this. At the end of the year, quite often you've lived through your character that year.
Yeah.
And so I always ask if that in itself probably changes you as a writer, but maybe even as a person. I don't know. I ask each person that. So how do you think writing about Einstein has affected or changed you?
Yeah, and it's funny, having listened to your show, I have heard you ask that a couple of times. And I, in some ways I'm going to be sheepish about answering it, because I would say that it doesn't affect me very much at all. I think I inhabit these characters while I'm writing, but I think I step outside them pretty easily. And given the way I've written for the last 14 years, which is, really focused for 4 hours once a week, and then working on, edits in the evening at times, you get some distance from your character, but I do spend that week in between kind of daydreaming about where it goes next when I can. But I've got a busy day job, so it's not something that I've had to partition that time out. And so I'm trying to think if any of the characters I've written over the years have left me kind of deeply affected by their kind of trip. And
well, it might not even be deeply, but just the thing. Okay, so it can be as simple as something like Einstein's a rodeo writer, an ex-rodeo. So in your mindset during this year, you're thinking about a guy who was a rodeo, and you even described how he's, stocky, short, rough, tough. So you have that in your mind. Just going through that and thinking about these things is like watching a movie. You watch a movie, it's going to affect you a little bit,
Absolutely. And look, there's no question. I would be surprised if any writer would answer this differently. I am entertained by my own writing. Like, there's no question about that. And I am at times moved by my own writing. I have at times been in tears as I've been writing because I get a scene that just moves me. So certainly in moments, like when I'm writing, I do feel in some senses transported. Like, when my job's at its busiest, those 4 hours in the Saturday morning are really a bit of an oasis for me because I just live in that story for those 4 hours. And the stories, I guess have an impact in that way, but I wouldn't say that I come away changed.
Damaged.
Well,
I think, but what it does is that because now when you go to write your next book, everything you went through to write Boom Boom going to change how you write the next book.
Yes, and even in the process, there's some really interesting questions can arise. Because the book I wrote about the two blues singers, that's been an interesting process because it's an interesting story because I probably never had a more interesting querying process because this was at a time just after I had left the Spitzer agency, so around 2020, and decided, okay, his daughter was now running the agency, and I don't think I was particularly her cup of tea, and so I was querying that book, and I was querying several books at the same time, so I was using pseudonyms when I was querying because literary agents are not that happy about getting multiple books from the same author. As I'm using those pseudonyms, I'm sending that book out under a pseudonym and I've never got so much interest in a book than that book until they found out I was a middle-aged to old white guy.
Right.
And look, I absolutely think this issue of cultural appropriation is a real concern and a serious thing. But it really forced me to think about that deeply in a way I hadn't, because when I wrote that book, I know this sounds naive, but it's written from the perspective of two young black women in the 1930s, and it really didn't. I was so motivated to write that book. I felt such a link to this idea of what would it be like to have this creative genius and be unable to actually share it with anybody. It just was such to me a strong, profound story that it hadn't really occurred to me very much that I was an old white guy writing in the voice of two young black women. And literary agents, publishers all said, look, I'm sorry, we like the book, but we could not represent or sell this book written by an old white guy. And that really is one that's given me a lot of thought, things to think about, and ultimately left me in a position where I feel like, look, I think agents and publishers and readers absolutely get to make decisions about who to represent, what kinds of books to publish, and what to read. But also, as someone, we're trying to be creative, we're trying to be artists. I get to choose what I write about. I can't take anybody's choice away from them about whether to represent, publish, or read. But I get to write the stories I want to write, and I'm comfortable with that. Yeah. So there's no question my characters have forced me to think pretty deeply about some issues.
Well, and that's a tough one because we're in a certain place in history where it's a big concern for people. Like, a straight actor can't play a gay man, or, a white man can't write about a black woman. Like, there's all of that going on, and it's a really strong feeling in society, right? And there's a real kind of battle over this thing. And personally, I think that it will resolve. It will in time settle down, and people will move beyond it. I think it's just one of those situations, because I've written some historical books about people that I'm nothing like, but I think what happens is you can find out the history and find out the placing and write a very good story in that situation as if you were there, right? I mean, it can be done, but I think it's just the particular time right now. So
no, and I actually understand and have sympathy for it. I feel like as a rock and roll fan, I feel like, look, Pat Boone ripped off Little Richard. There was definitely things that happened that were just wrong, and so I have a ton of sympathy for that position. But I also have this sense that, really, art aside, we want to imagine, like, if we're going to have a world where there's compassion and empathy, we have to believe that men can imagine what women feel, and that white people can imagine what black people feel, and that straight people can imagine what gay people feel, and that cis people can imagine what trans people feel. We have to be able to believe that we can imagine that and put ourselves in their shoes. And I think, how that transfers to art and the business of writing, to me, is a whole different thing. But I don't think we ever want to tell people, don't try and imagine what people different from you are feeling.
Yeah, that's how you can get into what it would be like. It's perspective, right? It's understanding the perspective from a different point of view. It's not, you know what I mean? You could never be a black woman. That's not going to happen.
No.
But you can understand it, and you can get across strong points and emotions that...
Absolutely. And the thing that struck such a chord with me when I read that story was actually how starkly it was clear to me that I had been privileged. Because, in my life, I've done a few different things. Like, so I played in a band. I've been a kind of a sports analytics guy for a couple of NHL teams. I've been a scientist, and now I'm writing. And there's never been a barrier, like, except my own talent level. Like, there's never been anybody that said, you're not allowed to do this. And so when I read that, I felt like, what would it be like if anybody had ever told me, you don't get to actually do this thing? And I don't think I have anything approaching genius level ability in any of the areas I've worked at. But I thought, imagine to be this kind of musical genius and not have an outlet. And it felt like something that was so close to me, because I didn't have that experience. But I could imagine that, look, you've been able to do whatever you wanted to do, Jeff, and it's so enriched your life. And, I felt like I could imagine that. And it had nothing to do with being black or a woman. It just had to do with, expressing yourself and having that opportunity or not having it.
Well, when Dave strips, he imagines himself as
Well, as long as he's the only one.
Yeah. He's the karate woman.
Yeah.
Well, listen. So, do you put in a subtext? Do you have a meaning? Do you have some sort of point that you want to get the reader?
I come back to this where I go, I don't know why I keep flashing back to this, because I listened to it recently. Your interview with Don Winslow, and him talking about entertainment versus I guess some kind of greater impact. And I would be surprised that there are that many writers that actually only see their work as entertainment. Like, I guess I aspire to something more than that, but if I try and put a finger on it, it's not a moral message. But I think even back to and I know reading as a youngster in my teen years, those writers who I read influenced who I was. And, I think writing can do that. I think it can actually cause you to aspire to be something better than you are, to maybe look closely to see what are your weaknesses, and, actually a little more self-analysis. I just think my reading has helped me to think more about the world. And I guess I would hope that even the stuff, because I think Boom Boom's Last Call is a straight noir genre book, but it's a character that I admire, that I think he's got courage and thinks about other people, and I think, as a kid reading, and I know this will be someone that gets dismissed. I read Louis L'Amour as a kid, and I will occasionally read Louis L'Amour westerns now as a kind of literary comfort food.
Right.
And those characters that were just strong, ethical, willing to sacrifice a lot for a principle, they may have been idealistic and unrealistic in some ways, but at the same time, I would say they actually gave me something to aspire to or something. And so, I guess when I'm writing, I'm not thinking there's a message, but it never feels to me like all I want to do is just entertain someone for a few hours.
Well, a lot of times it just happens organically when the character goes through things, they do things, they act in a certain way that means something, and that in itself is kind of a subtext or a meaning that came out of just a story without, you didn't sit there and sit down, I want to write a story where this person has to do this so that it was just sort of organic within the character. So
yes, I think it almost has to do that, because I think anything else to me draws readers out of the story. Like anytime I've read a book where it was clear to me there was a message I was supposed to take, it drew me out of the book.
Of course. If it sounds like it's too set up,
yeah.
And you have any sort of intelligence, you sort of lose it, right? I mean, it's kind of like boring, right?
Yeah.
So, and now violence. Do you think about the violence you write? Do you think about how you write violence on a page?
Yeah, and I guess I don't think of, I keep referring back to this, that I don't think I feel a real responsibility about that. I know that in some interviews authors talk about that they think carefully about, that there's a responsibility to describe the violence in a way that's, I don't know, I guess responsible, that there's a way that you can do it irresponsibly. And, I guess I'm always just trying to write those violent scenes in a way that feels realistic without being exploitive. There's no point there where I'm thinking, I want to make this as gory as possible because I know there are people out there who get off on that. I'm never thinking that. I'm just thinking, just try and describe this in a way that your readers could see and would feel real. And I would say, something I probably have in common, there's writers, I think, Cormac McCarthy's talked about the idea that, when he writes, there has to be a lot at stake. And what he really means, I think, is that, I think he might have been explicit about this, that it's life and death. And that almost always means violence. And I would say most of my books have violence in them. Not all of them, but most of them. And I think it's probably because I get more invested in a book where I think the characters have a lot at stake.
Well, speaking of violence, and you said that Einstein is quick to a punch, and how do you construct your fight scenes? Do you act them out?
Yeah. Well, I boxed for a couple of years in my early 20s, so I think I have, and see, yes, and a lot of that, I grew up in a kind of what I would say was a real, I know they talk about things like toxic masculinity, and I think that exists, but I also think there's some really non-toxic masculinity out there. And I grew up in a house where, the household was run, I would say, by my mom. She handled the finances and all that. My dad was also a military guy, so he was, but a gentle guy. But from the time I was 6 or 7, he would be on his knees in the living room, and he would be working with me and my brother going, here's how you fight. You pop the left, keep the right up by your chin. When you jab and you see an opening, you drop the right. And as a kid, you just grew up learning that and then boxed in later years. So I think I was not a guy that got in a bunch of fights, but I was raised in a house where there are times when you should be willing to fight. That there are, whether you're defending a friend or defending a principle, there are times that you should be prepared to fight. And I knew how to. So I think when I'm doing a fight scene, I think I know something about fighting, and so that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about, how do you throw a left hook?
Right.
How do you throw a right cross? Yeah, and I like writing those things. Yeah.
From the memories of all your beating people up.
Well, even as a boxer, I was usually getting beat up, I wouldn't say I was a particularly talented fighter, but I think I know that.
Who do you know in real life that you've killed off in your books?
Oh, let me think if I've got people in my life. I don't have many characters. You know, it's funny. In the book where the book from 12,000 years ago, where his daughter gets kidnapped. There's no question that the daughter in that vaguely resembles my own daughter, but she lives. I mean, I don't think I've ever killed off anybody I don't like. I'm not even sure in my real life I've ever wished that on anybody.
We got to have names and phone numbers here. We got, get some controversy here. Do some action.
Look, the fun is being able to imagine this. You know, it just feels sad if it's in real life.
Well, I've had people, writers, say that. A woman cuts some guy off in a lineup, and the writer writes her in as a character and kills her.
I do love that idea. It may show up down the road now, Alan. The idea that someone that just pisses me off, I can write them in as someone that I'm.
And we're talking New York Times bestseller. Did that. So I'm telling you, there's something about it. I think it's capturing that emotion of the anger of being cut off and being treated rudely. It's capturing that feeling that you have for those few minutes or whatever time you have that. And being able to write that on a page, that's the key to it. You know what I mean?
No, I agree with what you just said big time, that I think when I'm writing at my best, I'm feeling the emotions of the moment in the story, which, so when I am in tears about something I'm writing that I think is moving, I'm pretty happy about that. It feels like I found something there. And when my pulse is up 20 or 30 beats because I'm angry about something that's happening in the book, that feels like a good place to be in that moment too.
Yeah, I think it all comes out in the wash. Well, let's talk about how people find you besides being in bars and fights and boxing rings. Do you do social media much, or do you do website
Yeah, so we've got a website, jeffhoulahan.com. I should have all my social media handles. I think my ex, we call it Twitter handle still now, I think it's Jeff Houle. My wife, Kim, is my publicist, and that's what she does for a living, is social media and marketing. So, I am on Instagram, I think, also as Jeff Houle. So,
well, that's good. We'll have all that on our website as well so people can find it and that. But, so if your wife comes to you and she wants you on TikTok, be careful.
She's talked to me about that. She's gone, I might try to set up a little for TikTok. I go, yeah, I'm not sure I'm made for TikTok.
That's the beginning of the end, I'm telling you.
It's the beginning of the end.
Do not. Whatever you do, she'll put you in a weird outfit and you'll be dancing with the puppy dog on TikTok. And buy my book.
You know my wife, Alan? Because that sounds almost exactly plausible.
That's what I mean. So just remember this conversation, because when you say yes to TikTok, that'll be where you'll be sitting on this chair holding this dog in a bee outfit, and you'll be going, why did I say yes?
And I do not look good in a tutu.
No, well, see, there you go. That makes it sell even more.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it's been good having you on the show. Now, the book, Boom Boom's Last Call, and, of course, our guest is Jeff Houlahan. So thank you for being here.
It's been a real pleasure, Alan. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Jeff.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.